everyone. I'm Katie Yates, Public Relations Specialist at Maine Department of Inland Fisheries and Wildlife. Today I'm joined by 3 MDIFW staff members, deer biologist Nathan Bieber, game warden Brandon Sperry, and assistant to the Commissioner and Legislative Liaison Crystal Theriault. Today we are talking about deer hunting laws, any deer permits, and reviewing some frequently asked questions about deer hunting laws and regulations. For those watching at home, be sure to type your questions into the chat box. We'll field audience questions at the end of our discussion. We have a lot to cover and it might go a little over the hour, so I'm just going to get started. Keep in mind that this video is recorded, so if you would like to go back and watch later, it will be available on YouTube. So first thing I would like to start out with, Brandon, in Maine, we're very lucky to have access to private land. What are some do's and don'ts when it comes to accessing and hunting on private property?
Yeah, so Maine is pretty unique in how we tackle access to private property, in that legally you don't actually have to have specific permission to hunt on private property. That being said, it's strongly encouraged that you do, because it's just better for the landowner that they don't just show up and have somebody out there doing their thing. It's kind of a give and take, in that I would say, if you're going to set up to hunt a specific property, you should really seek out who owns that property, and then get their permission to do that. The take there might be in the wintertime, if you didn't ask that landowner's neighbor, you're tracking a buck, you can kind of use that and go through, so long as it's not posted. Posted property, obviously, you would have to have permission from the landowner. Something I kind of wanted to address too is I get a lot of questions about the paint, the purple paint on trees. That's another way to post your property. So if you see purple OSHA purple paint on trees, that means that the property that you're on is posted. As far as equipment, so in order to erect any stands or observation blinds or anything like that, you do have to get landowner permission to do that, and that stuff has to be labeled. The one thing that doesn't apply to is ground blinds that the person stays with the person. So they have like those one-man ground blinds that kind of just go over the person and they pack it up, put it in a backpack when they leave. That stuff doesn't need to be labeled. But if it's going to be in the woods and staying there, it needs to be labeled, and you have to have permission from the landowner to put that stuff there. That also applies to trail cameras. Sometimes landowners get a little frustrated when they find stuff on their property and they're not opposed to hunting, but they just wish somebody had told them, before putting it out there. As far as getting landowner permission, go to your local town office. They can usually get you some maps, either zoning maps or property maps. That's a really good way of figuring out who owns that property. We have some of those property owner permission books where you can go and even get written permission from the landowner, and that's probably the best, because then you can carry that with you, and if you run into one of us, you can pull it right out and show it to us. As far as some suggestions, I would say ask the landowner for specific usage. Just saying I want to hunt on your property, they might not know exactly what that entails, so you need to get permission to like cut down brush and stuff like that too. So if you say I want to go hunt and then you go set up a bear bait, they might kind of be blown away. But as far as deer hunting goes, you do need that permission for stand. Just let them know if you're going to cut shooting lanes or something like that, you're going to take some brush down or brush a blind out or something like that.
Great, thank you. So I'm going to shift gears a little, just because I think that maybe the bulk of our conversation will be on the subject of the any deer permit lottery. Nathan, quickly, can you give us a little history of how the lottery works?
Sure, thanks, Katie. So in most jurisdictions, wildlife agencies, they manage their deer populations by regulating how many antlerless deer hunters are taking. And here in Maine, we try to control that number, how many antlerless deer are being taken, by issuing different numbers of any deer permits every year. And we issue our any deer permits here by lottery. Just one clarification too, I want to say that when I'm using the word permit, you don't actually get a physical tag or anything like that, or a paper permit. You get assigned a permit number, so that's what I'm referring to when I say permit. So every year when our lottery opens, a hunter can apply for their permit free online. And in the online application, you're offered several drop-down menus where you can pick the wildlife management districts where you'd prefer to get your any deer permit or bonus permit as well. So for example, a hunter would prefer to get an any deer permit in District 17, but they'd also be willing to take one for District 26. Then in their application, they would select District 17 for their first preference, District 26 is their second preference. And then if they wanted to, they could also have a third preference, but you can also leave the later preferences blank. And so when the lottery is run, each hunter is assigned a random number, and those random numbers are used to determine who's going to get a permit. So if a hunter is selected, they'll get a permit for their preferred district. But if all of the permits for that preferred district have already been given away to other hunters, then they'll look at your second preference for a district. And if those are already all given away, then they'll go to your third preference. And if none are left of any of your preferences, then they'll move on to the next hunter. And so this just goes along until all the permits are assigned to people who have applied for permits. So that's kind of a simple overview, but there's some other structural details I want to add. The lottery itself goes through several stages where during each stage, certain percentages of the permits that are available are given to different groups. So in the first stage, if a district has 3,500 permits in it or more, then in that district, 2.5% of the permits will go to people that have a super PAC license. And then in the second stage of the lottery, 25% of the permits will go to people who have applied for a permit as a landowner. And then in a third stage, another 25% will go to junior hunters. And then after that, so about half of the permits are left at this point. The rest of those go to a regular part of the lottery that just divvies them out to anybody who's applied and didn't fit into one of those other categories. And then lastly, if after all that, there's still permits left over, then there's a final round that divvies out bonus permits that we'll talk about a little bit more later. And then so one other way you can get a bonus permit is to apply for a bonus permit that's available in one of our deer management subunits. This was something that was new last year. We currently have 2 of these units, and their intent is to try to increase antlerless deer harvest in areas that experience really high levels of deer-human conflict. So we have 2 of those currently, and when you're filling out your application and you're choosing the districts you'd be interested in getting a bonus permit for, you can select one of those deer management subunits. They'll be labeled as 25A and 26A, so if you weren't sure what those meant, that's what those are. And if you're selected, then that permit will be a bonus permit.
Thank you, Nathan. I'm going to turn to Crystal now and ask a little bit about the permit types and how to read your permit number.
Excellent. Thank you, Katie. I'm Crystal. And Nathan did mention that we don't actually get a physical permit when you're chosen to get an any deer permit. So you're actually looking for a number that's online. And the way that we read those is very important in determining where you can actually hunt. We refer to a wildlife management district as a WMD, so you'll often see that abbreviation. When you look at the number that's listed online, it'll start with the actual 2-digit number or 1-digit number of the wildlife management district. It'll then have a letter, which would either stand for a junior any deer permit, a landowner any deer permit, a regular, which could be for a resident or a non-resident. And then we have super PAC antlerless deer permits and bonus antlerless deer permits. So you may see a J, L, R, S, B, or an RB, which stands for those different permits. After that, you're going to actually have the permit number, which is just to identify your unique permit number. So paying careful attention to the first digits is really important to know where you need to hunt. And as Nathan also mentioned, last year we have subunits 25A and 26A. So those could be the first digits in the permit number. I think that's about it for those. We do have wildlife management district maps that people can look at to associate their permit number with the location that they can hunt. So you have to be sure that you hunt in those districts. Katie, I'll hand it back to you.
Thank you, Crystal. I don't want to cut you off.
No, that's okay.
So A follow-up question for you, Crystal, again, is if you could talk a little bit about bonus permits.
Sure. And I should sort of reiterate that you should write your permit number down so that when you go to the registration station, you have that readily available. You do have to put it on a tag on a deer if you are to harvest a deer. So you have to have that as soon as you reduce it to your possession, and during transportation, once you get to the registration station, that has to be presented to them. And just so talking a little bit about bonus permits, they're a little bit different than a regular any deer permit in that in districts where we have enough any deer permits that everybody who has applied receives one, and we still have additional any deer permits, the lottery would be rerun for anybody that's applied, and they may get an additional permit. A bonus permit allows somebody to harvest another antlerless deer above and beyond their one deer for the year. So Maine just has a 1 deer bag limit. I'm going to go into a little bit more detail here. So hunters are not required to fill their any deer permit prior to using a bonus deer permit. There's no order in which they are to use them, but sometimes it's beneficial. Hunters find it beneficial to utilize a bonus any deer permit first. That way it allows them to either harvest an antler deer or an antlerless deer on their regular any deer permit. So again, the bonus permit is only for an antlerless deer above and beyond your regular bag limit. So bonus deer permits may be used at any time during the archery, even the expanded archery seasons in designated areas. They can be used during the firearm season and the muzzleloading season, but only under the assigned WMD for the permit. We do provide bonus deer permits for residents as well as non-residents, and they're allocated in the same proportion as they are for the regular lottery. Bonus deer permits can also be transferred just as if they were in any deer permit. So a person who possesses one can transfer it to another hunter. And again, this allows the hunter to harvest an antlerless deer only. The deadline for transferring, which I'll go over a little bit more later, is October 26th, but I'll remind people of that. That's really the big points, the take-home message on bonus permit. So it is different than your regular any deer permit, and then it's an additional deer above and beyond your bag limit.
Thank you. And I think this is a good time just to go into transferring and swapping permits.
Sure. It can often be a little bit confusing. So just very basic here, the swap is when two hunters decide to exchange their permits so that they can have a different wildlife management district to hunt in. That's usually the reason behind it. The department doesn't have anything to do with it other than assigning a new number to those folks. But if somebody wants to do a swap, they need to find the person on their own. They can look at the list and try to contact somebody and try to make that happen. It does cost a one-time fee of $7. So the difference between a swap and a transfer is that a transfer goes one way. A hunter chooses to transfer their any deer permit or antlerless bonus permit to another hunter, and that other hunter receives it. This has to be done in all cases before October 26th, except for a little exception for junior hunters after the start of the hunting season, and there's a little bit more detail to that. But a swap is only allowed to be done once on a permit, and they have to be swapped for the same type of permit. So for example, junior permits can only be swapped for another junior permit. Same goes for a landowner permit. It can only be swapped for another landowner permit. Residents for residents, non-residents for non-residents. When you talk about transfers, there's a little bit more leeway. A transfer can be done to with any other permit holder. So you may do the transfer online. or you have an option to fill out a transfer request form, but we really encourage people to do it online. It's a much faster way to do this. So once you receive the new permit number and the transfer is complete, you can give that number to the person that you're transferring the permit to. So the person who's transferring it has to do the work on their end. And again, there's only one transfer allowed. So for both swaps and transfers, you can only do that one time. Just making sure I don't miss any of the points I wanted to mention. So one thing that gets a little bit tricky is when you can, do you want me to get into the Antlers deer permits and when they can be used and when they can't be used?
Yeah, go for it.
Actually consumed, okay. So there's a little bit more to this, but if you think about archery season, an archery hunter during the October season can take a deer of either sex without having an Antlers deer permit. So that still is true. Junior hunters on a youth day can take a deer of either sex without having an Antlers deer permit. However, if they do have an Antlers deer permit and they take an Antlers deer on that day or an antler deer, that invalidates their permit, so they can't transfer it. Another thing to mention is that if somebody wants to transfer a permit to a youth hunter, sometimes it's advantageous for them to wait until the youth day is over, which is the Saturday prior to the firearms hunting season on deer beginning. And the reason for that is if they do harvest an antlerless deer or a deer, they wouldn't be able to have a permit transferred to them anyway. So they might as well wait and see if they get a deer on that day. They'd still have time to do it as of midnight on October 26th. So one other quick point, if an archery hunter has an antlerless deer permit and they do harvest an antler deer or an antlerless deer, it invalidates their permit such that they can't transfer it, even if it is before that October 26th date. And there is some confusion about that, so I wanted to try to reiterate that. Can you think of anything else, Katie, that I might be missing on this?
I don't know. I think I had here to talk about if a child turns 16 and they get their adult license, if they can still use their junior permit. Brandon, do you have anything to add to that?
Can I actually interject something that I think was missed or not clear? I might have missed when you said it, but that exception that allows you to take an antlerless deer during October archery or youth day without an any deer permit only applies in districts where permits are issued. I'm not sure if we made that clear or not.
Very good point, Nathan.
So if you're in District 1 hunting up in Allagash where we don't have any deer permits, then a youth cannot take an antlerless deer without, well, at all, because there are no any deer permits.
Mm-hmm. I had a couple other things I wanted to mention that we frequently have asked is, can a person have multiple any deer permits transferred to them? And the answer is yes. However, it doesn't give them the option to harvest multiple deer with those permits unless they're bonus permits. What it does give them the option to do is hunt in different wildlife management districts if that's something they're interested in doing. Now, when you start talking about a bonus any antlerless deer permit, you can have multiple permits transferred. There's no limit to it, and a person can harvest as many deer as they have bonus antlerless deer permits.
Okay.
I think that sums it up for transfers and swaps. There's probably more I've missed, but
I'm sure
that's
there's
the
a
gist of
lot.
it. Mm-hmm.
Yeah. Brandon, did you have anything to add to the junior permits and junior hunters?
Just a little to add, I guess. I think Crystal talked about so you can get your junior hunting license, say they're 15 years old, they turn 16 after they get that license, they can continue to hunt on that junior license. They just have to continue to follow the laws that go with that, which means they have to be under effective control and supervision of an adult. Or if they are 16, if they've done the hunter safety course, then they can hunt basically as if they were an adult, but on that same license without swapping that over. I think other than that, so this changed a couple years ago, but I said in the presence of, under effective control, if they're under 10, they actually have to be within 20 feet of that supervisory adult. Just wanted to make that clear as well.
Thank you so much. So I'm actually going to stick with you here for the next question, which is the difference, or maybe talking a little bit about legal versus illegal hunting equipment.
Yeah, so we have a lot of different seasons, and basically in order they would go. We always start with bow season. For bows specifically, they have to be at least a 35-pound draw and a 7/8 of an inch broadhead. With the archery is also crossbow that just recently changed, but so you can use crossbows during the archery season, but I think Crystal can talk a little more about the ins and outs of that. That they have to have a 100-pound draw with same 7/8 broadhead. That would move you into firearms after that. Firearms basically is shell and cartridge. As far as deer go, has to be at least a 22 Magnum. And then it goes into muzzleloader. Muzzleloader has to be at least a 40 cal muzzleloader. So we get some questions about air bows and whether they count as a bow or a crossbow, and they don't actually count as either. So basically, if the implement doesn't fall under the definition of one of the seasons, then you can't use it. So like right now, air bows are not a legal implement to use, along with like spears or any of those, some of that stuff's coming back. So.
Thank you very much for clarifying. So Crystal, actually this might be a really good time to get into crossbow regulations.
Sure, I'll do my very best. So we had a law change, and beginning on January 1st of this year, the law has changed to expand crossbow hunting during the regular October archery season on deer. And it's also extended to the wild turkey hunting season in the fall. And this will be allowed for the next 3 years. It's sort of a trial run to see how it works and if there are any issues with it. And at the end of those 3 years, the legislature will have an opportunity to review the law and see if it's something that they want to continue with. So I'll try to run down some of the major points here. A person that's using a crossbow during this October open archery season may not harvest an antlerless deer unless they have any deer permit. So that is different than a person who uses traditional archery equipment during the October archery season. They can harvest either sex without the permit. They can continue to do that. The new law also allows a person to have either the archery license or the firearms hunting license in addition to a crossbow permit to be able to hunt with their crossbow. So that means that a person has to show that they've taken either the firearms hunter safety course or the archery hunter safety course in addition to a crossbow safety course. And one really cool thing I'd like to mention is that the department has just launched a complete online crossbow safety course for all hunters to be able to take. That can be found on our website. And if you've already held a license, either a firearms hunting license or an archery license in this state or any other state, you can show that as proof of having taken the course or having the license to be able to purchase your crossbow permit as well. So I'll talk a little bit more about the specifics, the differences between somebody under 65 and somebody over 65. The legislature actually passed a law a few years ago to allow folks over 65 and over to be able to hunt during any season for any species with a crossbow. Now that has not changed. And in fact, folks who are 65 and older can also harvest an antlerless deer during the October archery season without a permit. Again, as I mentioned before, anybody under the age of 65 would have to have an antlerless deer permit to be able to harvest an antlerless deer during that time frame. There's also what we call a permanent disability permit that we issue for use of crossbow, and those folks who have that permit can hunt during the October archery season for either sex deer without having a permit. So those are kind of the two exceptions. I want to talk a little bit about hunter orange requirements as they relate to crossbow use. A person may not hunt with crossbows or firearms during any open firearm season on deer unless they're wearing 2 articles of hunter orange. That has to be a hat, and the other article must cover a major portion of their torso, and it has to be at least 50% hunter orange in color. Also, any person that hunts with a firearm or crossbow in a wildlife management district where a moose hunt is currently open has to wear at least 1 article of solid color orange clothing. And we can talk a little bit more. Brandon didn't really go into the detail of crossbow equipment as much, did he? Or I can't remember. Okay, I'll talk about that a little bit too.
Yeah.
Okay. So crossbows have to have a shoulder type stock. The draw weight has to be at least 100 pounds, and there's no maximum. The arrowheads have to be mechanical broadheads when they're open. They must be at least 7/8 inch wide. And they also have to have a mechanical trigger safety device that's working in good condition. There's a couple of things that we don't allow. We don't allow handheld pistol type crossbows or arrows with any explosive or poisonous tips. And we do allow crossbows to be equipped with scopes or different sights that can be used. If there's any other things that you'd like me to mention about crossbows, I can delve into those.
I think that's good for now, but I also will remind people who are watching that you can type in a question at any point in time in the chat box, and we will be reviewing the questions at the end of our discussion, so in about half an hour. So if you have a question about something Crystal's mentioning or anything that we've talked about so far, you can go ahead and put it in the chat box now. And we'll be getting to those later. But I think what we'll do is we will move on now to Nathan, and I'll ask you to talk a little bit about updates to the expanded archery areas.
Yeah, for our bow hunters out there, we did make a few adjustments to some of our expanded archery areas this year. Our expanded archery areas, those are used in kind of the more developed parts of the state where it's a little more challenging to achieve the desired level of antlerless deer removal. Usually because it's too developed, there's too many houses, so there's not a lot of land access, or there might be discharge ordinances locally, so you can't shoot a firearm in those areas. So these are areas where there's usually a lot of people and it's difficult to hunt. So this is a way for us to try to increase the opportunity for people to harvest deer in these areas. We made adjustments to 4 of our expanded archery areas this year. The first is the Augusta area. So we added some land onto that expanded archery area on the north side of it. So it's still generally the same shape as the old area. We've just added additional land area to the north. Similarly, in the Camden area, we added a much smaller area to the north of that. And the Lewiston area, we added a pretty sizable chunk of land to the east of that area. And then lastly, the Wildlife Management District 24 area kind of got reverted to how it originally was, if anyone has been hunting expanded archery for a very long time. So what we added this year was then some land just north of Kittery and also around Kennebunk. So I think this was the original implementation of that area. It was changed sometime in the early 2000s, and we've just reverted it this year. One thing I'll add on expanded archery that hasn't come up yet too, there's a different sort of permit for expanded archery hunting. So generally the bag limit's going to be 1 deer, but if you're hunting in expanded archery, you can actually buy an expanded archery specific permit to take another buck, or you can also buy expanded archery specific antlerless permits, any number of those, as many as you can fill. So if you're hunting in those areas, we're definitely trying to incentivize people to get out there and remove deer in those tough to hunt areas.
Thank you, Nathan. I think now is a good time for us to maybe move on to baiting deer. So Brandon, maybe could you talk a little bit about baiting for deer?
Sure. So there's actually 2 places in the law book that speaks about baiting versus feeding and that kind of stuff. So you can feed deer legally right now between December 15th and June 1st. After June 1st, you have to stop placing bait for deer to come into. And it's not legal to hunt over any kind of bait either. One thing I guess I will address, because I've had questions on it before, is food plots. The law does allow for people to hunt over standing crop that's been cut as part of agricultural practices. Any kind of natural food source, they can still hunt over all of that stuff. Just can't be something that you placed specifically as food for deer in a particular area. Other than that, I think that's what I got.
Thank you so much. And I think this might be an appropriate time to talk about CWD and transporting your deer. Nathan?
Yeah, thanks. A little bit on chronic wasting disease, or CWD, for anyone that doesn't know anything about it. There are some regulations and restrictions in Maine that are directly related to CWD, so this ties into our conversation here today. CWD, it's a disease that impacts deer and moose and a few other members of that family, like caribou. And it's caused by a mutated protein that's called a prion. And the prions can be passed between animals, or they can also be picked up from the environment. And the short of it is the disease eventually results in some brain lesions, which severely impair a deer's brain functions. There's no treatment for it. There's no vaccine. And if a deer gets CWD and nothing else kills it first, the CWD will kill that animal. Thankfully, we don't have the disease yet in Maine, and we'd very much like to keep it that way. So in order to help limit the likelihood of an infected deer or infected deer parts being brought into Maine, we recently, 2 or 3 years ago, put some restrictions in place on how you can transport a deer carcass around. So from any state or province other than New Hampshire, you cannot bring a whole deer carcass into Maine. You can only bring in lower risk body parts like boned out meat, hardened antlers, clean skull caps, capes and hides without a skull, teeth, and finished mounts. So the idea here is basically to keep people from, say, going to Pennsylvania where they have CWD, or some other state that's got it, harvesting a deer there, and then bringing that deer back into Maine, where they maybe butcher it here and leave parts on the landscape that could expose our native Maine deer to the disease. So hopefully this will help limit the likelihood that CWD spreads into our state. In addition to these sorts of restrictions, we also monitor for CWD every year. We collect about 500 samples or so from hunter-killed animals to test for CWD. So we're in a lucky position here where we don't have it yet in Maine. No CWD in New Hampshire, Vermont either. The closest is Pennsylvania. So we've got a bit of a buffer there, but as I said, we definitely do not want it showing up here.
So a good follow-up question, Nathan, would be how to present your deer at registration stations and whether or not tagging is required this fall.
Registration this year is going to look pretty much like previous years, and that you still have to present your deer in person at the registration station. The main difference, of course, is that we are still working around the pandemic and all the implications that go along with that. So we do encourage folks to exercise some caution when they take their animals in. These stations could be pretty busy during some periods, like on opening day and on Saturdays. So please be mindful of crowding other people and respect people's space, and respect the requirements that the business may have in place to keep their establishment clean and safe and open.
Thank you so much. So let's see, moving on here, Crystal, what can you do if you can't track your deer? What sort of resources are available for hunters out there?
Great question. So I think a lot of hunters don't realize that we actually license some folks under what we call a leashed dog tracking license. And these people have specially trained dogs to be able to track mostly big game animals that have been harvested and the hunter's unable to find them. So we actually have a list located on our website. The contact information is there, and there are probably between 12 and 15 folks that do this around the state. They're very busy during the hunting season, but if you can reach one and they're able and willing to come to your location, they may charge a fee. So you want to ask them ahead of time. But it's a wonderful resource to be able to locate the animal and be able to register it afterwards. So we strongly encourage people to use this resource if they can. One quick thing, I just wanted to backtrack a little bit on the crossbow use. One thing I forgot to mention, and this has been a common question, but people want to know if they're under 65, if they can hunt in the expanded archery areas during October. They can with a crossbow, but they cannot hunt under the authority of their expanded archery permits. So they have to use their crossbow permit and either their firearms license or their archery license and register their one deer. They can't, harvest multiple under an expanded archery permit, even though they're in that area. And that was what I wanted to say.
Okay, so I actually have a follow-up question. It's a little bit more about CWD related, I think, but is it best practice to not use real Dopey urine? Nathan, maybe is a good question for you.
Our recommendation as an agency is that you use synthetic lures or something other than natural urine-based lures at this point. They are developing some tests that can potentially detect whether or not a batch of actual urine-based lures are infected or not, but there's not really a scientific consensus yet on the efficacy of those tests, and they're not widely adopted yet. So given that urine can pose a risk and it's not super well controlled or tested yet, we still do recommend people use synthetics rather than natural urine lures. It is, however, legal to use a urine-based lure if you're so inclined to do so.
Thank you so much. So I just want to remind people that you can find our laws available on our website. You can download our digital law book. You can scan that, and also the fact sheets. You can scan those. They're PDF files, so it's very easy to search and find the laws that you're looking for and the information that might be relevant to the species or the season that you're hunting. So I just want to ask the panelists if there's anything that they want to add before I move over to the questions that are kind of coming in now from the audience.
To add on real quick about finding laws and stuff, ours is obviously a summary. Most people know that. If there's a law that you're specifically looking for and you don't see it on the summary, you can Google Maine statutes. Title 12 is what we fall under, and there is a search function on the Maine statutes page where you can literally type in a keyword and it might bring you right to what you're looking for. I get that question a lot.
Thank you so much. I think that's a great point.
Just to add to what Brandon was saying, in addition to Title 12 law, we also have department rules. And there's a link to those rule chapters under our website. You can also find them under the Department of Secretary of State, and they have rules listed for every agency. So if you can't find something in the statute, in the law, you want to look at the rules as well, because that generally has more specific guidance on a particular area.
Thank you so much. So now I'm going to turn over to some of the questions that are coming in from our audience. The first one that I'm going to pitch to you guys is, can you bone and pack out a deer from the field prior to taking it to the checking station? Nathan, that might be a good one for you. Not sure.
Yeah, any others feel the way in, but you're definitely, when you show up at the registration station, going to have to be able to identify the sex of that animal. And if it was a buck, you are going to need to verify whether it had antlers, because a buck without antlers is still going to be registered as an antlerless deer. So you're going to have to be able to tell what that deer was. You can't just bring in packaged meat with no way to identify what exactly is in those packages.
And I'll just remind everyone watching, if you have any questions about the laws, now's a good time to ask them. If you have any questions about any deer permits or any of the things that we've been discussing today, crossbow or firearm deer hunting, you can type that into the chat box now, and it's a good time to ask the panelists. But it doesn't look like too many other questions are coming in, so I wasn't sure. We can kind of hang out here for a minute, and if Crystal, Nathan, Brandon, you guys want to add anything from the discussion that we've had today?
I wanted to mention that if you go to our hunting laws and rules on our website, we have some wonderful downloads, just 1-page or 2-page charts that are really handy, because most people are interested in the sunrise sunset table. They're interested in the season dates and bag limits. So we do have some really quick reference PDFs that you can just print off and have with you if that's something you'd like to have, which makes it pretty handy, and you don't have to upload the entire book or read the entire book to find those things.
Crystal, actually, so a question just came in through Facebook. I read in last month's Northwood Sporting Journal that you could legally use a crossbow if you held a firearm safety course. Let's see, it's not in the law book. So is that true?
You can if you have a firearm safety course, but in addition to that, you have to have completed a crossbow education course. And if everybody thinks about their license as being the base, so they either have to have the firearms license or the archery license, and then a permit is something in addition to their license. So they have to have that crossbow permit to go with it. But the answer is yes, they can do it. They can have just the firearms hunter safety course, which is different than the way it used to be, but they also have to have the crossbow safety course.
So I don't have any other questions coming in, but I don't want to cut anyone off if they're sort of just tuning in now. But I will just remind everyone that if you have a question and you'd like to get some answers, it's probably on our website. You can always message us on Facebook if you want to. You can look for the numbers to the regional offices on our website and reach out that way. Our staff are always willing to talk to people and help them through some of the questions that they might be having. This stuff is rather complicated, and so we want to be able to be a resource for people out there. So I'm gonna let if Crystal, Nathan, and Brandon want to add anything that I may have forgotten or something that they frequently hear when they're out in the field or talking with the public. I'll give them a minute to chime in, and then if no other questions come in, I think we can wrap up a little early, which I'm pretty surprised by.
I'll throw in another little legal tidbit that I don't think is known by probably as many people as it should be. And Crystal or Brandon, correct me if I had this wrong, but I'm pretty sure you can harvest a bear during the deer hunting season without a bear permit. Is that correct?
That is correct. So if you have your big game hunting license and you're hunting deer during the firearms season on deer, you can take a bear with that license.
So we did just get a question in. If you have an any deer permit, does a buck still have to be 3 inches on the antlers?
No, you can use your antlerless deer permit. So it would be considered an immature buck maybe, but they would have to use their any deer permit if it was less than 3 inches. and Brandon can weigh in too if he'd like.
That pretty much covers it. I was going to add the 3-inch antler law, but that got covered. So one thing a little off topic, but that I get asked regularly is about the WMDs, because some people are confused a little bit sometimes about where the borders are and how to figure that all out. On our website, you can go and find actually a map of the WMDs. Anytime I have to look at it, I just Google Maine WMD. Sometimes you get weapons of mass destruction stuff, but usually you can find what you're looking for.
We'll post the link in the comments.
Okay, perfect. On top of that, it'll show you like a grayed out map of the state with all of the WMDs on it. If you click on the, like, if I'm looking for WMD 18, if you click on the 18, it'll actually bring you to like a Google Earth image where it shows you the boundaries. I've run into quite a few people who didn't know they could click on that map and actually bring up a Google Earth image that is a lot easier to look at than looking at a map and reading the description of the WMD.
In that same vein, you can also Google Maine towns by wildlife management district, and we have on our website a spot where you can click a letter of the alphabet to find your town, and it'll list behind your town which district or districts it's a part of.
So I'm just going to remind everybody watching that we are continuing with this panel discussion series next Monday from 1 to 2 p.m. just like today. And it will be on the topic of deer hunting gear. And then the Monday after that, we will be talking about after the shot, carcass care, blood tracking, so some of the essential skills that you'll need to be successful in that area. And again, with MDIFW staff who are also avid deer hunters. So to make sure that you remember those and join us for those discussion. If you have questions in those areas as well, we'll be taking questions at the end just like today. And I think I'm not seeing any more questions come in. And so I think that might be it for today. I want to thank my panelists here for joining me for a fun discussion on deer hunting laws. And oh, actually, one more thing coming in. Do deer smell permethrin?
Well, I have no idea. So if either of you two do, feel free to chime in. I do not know.
I don't know the answer to that.
It's probably worth the risk because tick safety is very important.
Generally, what I do in preparation for the hunting season is I take all my clothing outside. I spray everything down with permethrin on one side. I let it dry. I flip it over. I spray the other side, and I let it air out for several days if I can, if it's dry outside. I then usually hang it up for maybe a couple more days, and then I put it in a tote with some fir boughs so that it takes on a woodsy smell. So that may help cover up any odor that the permethrin puts off. But I haven't heard anybody say that it would scare a deer, and I would still wear it to be sure because I'd rather prevent any risk of tick-related illnesses. So.
Yeah, not really related to laws, but we will be talking about gear next Monday and then following that after the shot. So thank you very much to all of my panelists here for joining me today. It was a great discussion, and I look forward to seeing all of the people in the audience